Great. Well, it's about 2 minutes after the hour, and I see participants continuing to come in, but I am going to begin and kick things off, given that we want to cover quite a bit of ground here and on these important issues. Uh, to everyone, welcome to the Charity and Security Network's webinar and conversation regarding the 20th anniversary of what was called the Global War on Terror. But more to the point, we are here to sort of give a quick look back and taking stock of what came to be in the weeks and months after the 9/11 attacks, and specifically with respect to the laws and policies that evolved quickly during that time and solidified in the decades since, and their implications for civil society and more specifically humanitarian and peace building programs and efforts. And we are thrilled to have a collection of experts with us today, and I will introduce them in a moment. But before I do that, I just want to give a quick housekeeping sort of landscape. We are in webinar mode, which I believe means you'll see myself, you'll see our panelists, but at any time during this conversation, if a question occurs to you or you would like to ask a question, there is a Q&A function down in the bar below the screen, and you can click on that and write out your question. And toward the end of the conversation, we are really trying to protect 20 minutes or so to have a dynamic and organic question and answer session. So if a question occurs to you during the conversation, please enter it there. As we enter the Q&A session toward the end, you can use the raise hand icon and we'll facilitate that conversation. So now I would like to turn to who we have with us today. And as I said, we have quite a range of expertise and experience. We have with us Perry Kamak, I'm probably not pronouncing that right, Kamak, who is the program director at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And Perry has some very interesting background as a government official, working for nearly a decade on foreign policy issues with someone who was then Senator Joseph Biden, and before that, Senator John Kerry, on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He also worked on the policy planning staff at the US State Department and also served at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, DC, as well as an assistant adjunct professor at George Washington University. I invited Perry because my own background, having come out of philanthropy, I feel that philanthropy has a certain perch and can offer a perspective, having the ability to understand what a range of different practitioners and organizations are doing. I also happen to feel, and I think that Perry and Patty would agree, that there is a critical role that philanthropy has to play, not only as a supporter of these activities, but as an advocate for them. So more on that later. We also have Kay Gunain with us, who is the senior advisor here at the Charity and Security Network. My predecessor and someone whose shoes I'm continuing to try to fill. Reading her bio, I'm going to ad lib a little bit. It says she's a public interest attorney who specializes in the rights of nonprofit organizations, and that's true. But as Kay said to me once, and I think she would say, she is an activist and a grassroots activist who happens to have a law degree, so she brings that expertise, rather than an attorney who works on, you know, how did you put it, Kay? You have legal skills, and so you bring them to bear as a rebel rouser. And so that's probably the best I could do and probably the most accurate thing I would say. But Kay founded the Charity and Security Network over a decade ago as a response to, and hopefully an antidote to, the overreach and the burdens and challenges that the post 9/11 era has thrown up to humanitarian, human rights, and peace building work. We also have Patty McElreevy with us, who is currently the president and CEO of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, which is a great name. I think anyone who doesn't know it begs, what is that about? And that's probably what you want in a name. And the Center for Disaster Philanthropy works with funders, non-governmental organizations, and other partners to mobilize a whole range of resources to strengthen communities to withstand disasters. And as we all know, many of these disasters often occur in conflict zones. So it's exactly the right spot to be with respect to the issues we're talking about. Patty has over 25 years of experience on international humanitarian policy and practice. And I'm very eager to hear her perspective and also sort of prognosis. And then finally, Lisa Shirk, I should say Dr. Lisa Shirk, who's the visiting chair of peace studies, the Starman visiting chair at the University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for Peace Studies. Again, I'm going to ad lib a little bit. Lisa and I go way back because Lisa was doing incredible peace building work at Eastern Mennonite University. And when I was at the Plowshares Fund, we had made grants to Lisa for our conflict resolution work. And we've just sort of stayed in touch and sometimes been in the same room, sometimes, at arm's length. But Lisa's not only scholarly research, but practitioner and practical work in the field is really quite impressive. She's the author of 11 books on locally led peace building. And I think the most, I don't know if it's the most recent, but a very relevant one is called Designing a Comprehensive Peace Process in Afghanistan, which was published by the USIP, United States Institute of Peace. Lisa also worked in Afghanistan from 2009 to 2014. So again, very relevant and apropos of what's happening today. So welcome to this crew of experts. And I am going to do my best to cover the landscape of questions we have and try to keep this conversation on the one hand focused, but also organic. So what I'm going to do is start off, because context is very important, by asking Kay to give a little bit of her perspective and sort of, history, if you will. And just to tee this up a bit, from 2000 to 2009, Kay served as the director of nonprofit speech rights at an organization called OMB Watch. And during this period, obviously, it was the first 6-7 years of the post 9/11 era. And we saw military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan begin. We saw other terrorist attacks around the world. So Kay, I'm curious, when did you first realize that the policies that were unfolding in the wake of 9/11 were actually creating serious challenges to civil society writ large? And what are, in your view, the most significant laws and policies that evolved during that time that are still basically throwing up these obstacles today?
That's when I first realized it's a very interesting question. I think as soon as the initial shock of the attacks wore off, myself, but also many of my colleagues in DC immediately saw what was starting to take shape in Congress, what ultimately ended up being the Patriot Act, as being a significant threat to civil liberties, not just for individuals, but for organizations, especially advocacy organizations and Muslim-led organizations. Even before the Patriot Act passed, the ACLU held a workshop where we were looking at the various proposals and basically said, this Patriot Act is a checklist of the right-wing wish list from the past decade on strengthening surveillance powers and other things. And indeed, when it passed, that's exactly what it turned out to be. It amended a lot of other laws, sanctions laws, expanded the material support prohibition, allowed for shutdown of organizations, pending investigation, freezing of funds, and all of that. And Executive Order 13224 was issued right around this time when the global war on terror was declared, applied the material support prohibition to anyone that might have an interaction with a counterterrorism listing, whatever organization or individual got listed. And it also expanded the prohibition to dealing with anyone otherwise associated with. So it was very vague and the powers were very, very broad, which is a very dangerous combination. So by the end of September 2001, the stage was set, and we were very concerned and we're tracking very closely what happened. In December of that year, the three biggest Muslim charities in the US were shut down and all their assets frozen. And over the next several years, there was a concerted effort to try to provide them with get them some due process in their appeals, but also to get those funds unfrozen so that the beneficiaries who were the were supposed to receive assistance with those funds would benefit. But that never happened. Treasury refused to set up any process to protect frozen funds used for beneficiaries. And instead, what they did was come up with a list of so-called voluntary guidelines. And the Council on Foundations led a group that pushed back against these guidelines over the course of years. They were never withdrawn, but they're so bad, they're pretty much ignored by the nonprofit sector ever since. But so those were the early days and early years. There was a lot of focus on those guidelines and on trying to deal with the impact on Muslim charities, because more counterterrorism designations against Muslim organizations happened over the course of the 8 years of the George W. Bush administration. And it had an incredible chilling effect, because we all saw what was happening and worried about our own organizations being subject to the same treatment. You could just suddenly, an executive order could be issued. It could name you a supporter of terrorism. All your assets would be frozen. FBI agents would come and seize all your computers and files. You wouldn't even have the information you needed to contact your lawyers unless you had their phone number memorized. So it had a huge impact on all international programs during that time. What happened next when Obama was elected, and the idea of the Charity Security Network was developed by this coalition that had been working on these issues all that time, and that's when we launched it. I just say that you'll hear more about the different laws and impacts over the course of time, but the law has substantially changed very little since then, other than you'll hear about the Humanitarian Law Project case in the Supreme Court, which expanded restrictions to peace building work. The impact of the Somalia famine in 2011, when legal restrictions were not relaxed, so that people couldn't get into al-Shabaab areas to provide aid, and many 250,000 people died. So there have been a few good developments. The Financial Action Task Force, the International Anti-Money Laundering, Anti-Terrorist Financing Task Force, revised its recommendation on anti-terrorist regulation of nonprofits in 2016 to require risk-based proportionate measures that do not unduly disrupt the operations of nonprofit organizations. So that's the international standard that the US still needs to formally adopt. And then also in 2019, the UN Security Council Resolution 2462 consolidated UN counterterrorism sanctions, and for the first time called for all these programs to be consistent with international humanitarian and human rights law. So that, of course, the devil is in the detail of implementation of these things, but that's where things stand. So we thought that the Charity Security Network would be a 3-year project, and because the Obama administration would fix all this stuff, and then we could all go back to normal. We now know that there's no going back to that pre-9/11 normal, and that dealing with these issues is something we all have to do on a long-term basis.
Well, thank you for that. You covered a lot of ground, and I think I suspect our audience is fairly well informed. But I mean, there were some numbers in there of executive orders and laws and so on. But I want to open it up to the other panelists, and two things I heard I'd love to have you comment on. One is your own experience during that sort of initial decade, if you will. I imagine some of you were in the field. Perry, maybe you were in government. I'm curious what you saw and felt, and when did you sort of realize, wow, there's a lot more here than meets the eye in terms of an immediate response to security. The other aspect, Kay, when you gave examples of some positive developments, is the international arena, the UN, for example, and the fact that US law and policy, and frankly, financial strength really is determinative of a lot that happens in the world. And so maybe Patty, I'll start with you, but Perry and Lisa, I'd love to hear, like, what was your antenna like in those initial years, and when did you begin to, or did you begin to think, oh my gosh, this is going to have incredible implications for civil society, for peace building, for humanitarian work?
Yeah, so Paul, thank you. I mean, Kay, that was a great overview. I mean, interestingly, for the first 11 years, from 2000 to 2011, I was working in country level responses or regional level responses. And so the question you're asking about, like, how did it feel? I mean, it seemed like additional legal restrictions. I'll be honest, I don't think it was felt in the same way it's been felt in the years since. And I feel some countries it was obviously much deeper felt. I was working mostly in the African continent. And I know Afghanistan, there was a lot of concerns there about, the whole force multiplier. There were a lot of issues, complexities that came out, and I'll leave it to Lisa to talk about how some of that played out and got conflated and mixed in with the counterterrorism issues. But overseas, in a lot of the work we did, it was just additional rules, legal rules, restrictions, more bureaucracy that we had to follow, and involvements from, the legal and financial staff in terms of things they were scared of and wanted us to address. I really think it has grown exponentially since its early days. And that's partly because less to do in some ways, I would argue, than the US's restrictions, but in how others are influenced and follow upon the US's restrictions. So how the UN interprets and puts these counterterrorism regulations into their own agreements, and how organizations aren't attentive to that at field level and sign agreements that have then restrictions about identifying beneficiaries. New things that have started to come out over the years, new ideas of how to address at that much more individual level. I would say that's what I would see as the biggest concern is that it's that amplification of this, interpretation of it, how host governments, how countries in conflict have seen utilizing these regulations as a way to further some of their own initiatives to kind of push humanitarian or peace building NGOs into areas of the country they want them to work with, populations they want them to work. That kind of almost unintended consequences, I feel are much harder on the NGO community than the initial regulations, in a sense, and that then has brought more attention to the origin of a lot of those restrictions. I'm going to pause there and let others speak.
I guess I can jump in here, and the only thing I think I would add from my vantage point is that it's really, I think, important to keep in mind that issues like material support provision, the kind of Executive Order 13224 Patriot Act, they didn't come out of a kind of political vacuum. So, but instead they came as kind of a component or components of a highly militarized US response. I mean, we could imagine a response to 9/11 that of course had a military component, but really focused on intelligence sharing, diplomatic cooperation, police action. Instead, we got two imperialistic invasions that led to 20 years of war and everything that came with it, thousands of Americans dead, hundreds of thousands of others dead. And with that, I think, came a kind of delegitimization of diplomacy with Iran, with Hamas, with Hezbollah, and ultimately, in many cases, it's the civil society actors, humanitarian organizations, peacekeepers who bear the brunt of that approach. And so I think we've learned slowly the hard way some lessons in terms of overt military occupation, but I don't think we've learned the corollary lessons in terms of what that means for sanctions policy, for diplomacy, for intelligence gathering, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll stop there.
I'll jump in here then. I think it's important to remember President Bush's words after 9/11, that you're either with us or against us, because I think the Patriot Act emerged from that, we're going to divide the world into our allies and our enemies. And civil society, you have to decide, are you going to overtly put the US flag on everything that you do, or are you going to try to protect some sort of impartial civil society space, which doesn't mean that you're for the Taliban. It just means that you're not overtly taking sides so that you can still travel to areas where there may be a group that is on a terrorist list from the UN or the US. So for example, in the Horn of Africa, you know, if you were doing peace building, all of a sudden you couldn't travel to where Al-Shabaab was, you know, operating or in control. You couldn't have conversations with them. You couldn't do research on their grievances or their approach. And, you know, basically this you're with us or against us approach put 100% into those military approaches, because it said, yeah, none of this diplomacy, none of the civil society peace building is going to work. So just trust us, and we're going to fight this war. And all you NGOs, you just stay home and you become our implementing partners, and we'll tell you what to do. Well, this has had a devastating effect on peace building all over the world, because it means that civil society has no longer been able to have conversations with and do research on groups that are on these terrorist lists. So in Afghanistan, you know, I would say it's endangered the very civil society that is now being targeted by the Taliban. It was the Patriot Act that put them into this situation where, you know, many of them for many years tried to stay impartial, and then as the war went on and on and on, they realized, okay, well, if we're going to get funding for peace building, then we have to stop talking to the Taliban. Well, now there's not relationships with the Taliban. Now we really need to have those open lines of communication, and we don't have them precisely because of these material support laws.
Well, thank you. And yes, the political context, you know, at the risk of dating ourselves or maybe myself, I was going to say at the beginning, well, we all live through this, and I have to realize there are a lot of practitioners in the NGO world now that lived through it in a very different phase of life. And so I think it's also very important to keep our collective work, but also our generational experiences in mind as well. Kay, you mentioned Humanitarian Law Project versus Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. And I wanted to ask all of you about that, and let me give my own sort of context here. We've talked a little bit about Congress and the politicization and the militarization of basically all foreign and security policy in the wake of 9/11. We talked about presidents, we talked about the UN and other nations. But it turns out the US Supreme Court had a pivotal role and a pivotal influence in 2010 with a case called Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. And I wanted to, I guess, ask Kay to maybe explain that a bit, and then others to say, you know, did that amplify, or did that sort of take things to the next level? Because the material support law is in my view, it's often the long pole in the tent. And what I mean by that is this clause in American law that says you shall not provide material support is sort of very broad and a bit vague, and therefore guilt by association happens. The politicization of terrorism is fraught, but it has real implications for civil society and their efforts. So I'm going to stop there and maybe ask Kay to just give a quick Cliff's Notes, a sort of legal, you know, Nina Totenberg overview of that case, and then others to say, you know, yes or no, and so on. Thank you.
Nina Totenberg, that's a high bar. I'll go for it. And there's a detailed summary on our website. So for those of you who would like to know more and have the stomach to read about a case that's in the Supreme Court Hall of Shame, along with the Dred Scott decision and others, you can go there to find it. Basically, the material support prohibition was passed before 9/11 in the mid-90s with a bombing in New York City. And it was expanded to include training, expert advice, and personnel and services. And the Humanitarian Law Project wanted to provide basically peace building kind of training and training in international humanitarian law to the PKK in Turkey and the Tamil Tigers. And they asked, rather than do this and get prosecuted and challenge the constitutionality of the law, they went to the Supreme Court for what's called a declaratory judgment. They tell us ahead of time if this would be legal this is what we'd like to do. And for the case wound its way through the federal court system with appeals back and forth over the course of 14 years, with the Humanitarian Law Project prevailing that the definitions applied to those activities was unconstitutional infringement on free speech. Then the Supreme Court just basically upended everything in their decision in 2010 that said if Congress wants this to apply to these, the prohibition to apply to these activities, it's constitutional for them to do so because this has to do with national security. So they essentially, they acknowledged this was an invasion of constitutional rights, but said basically there's a national security exception in this case. And it was unfortunately the Obama administration that argued for the prohibition at the Supreme Court. Then Solicitor General Elijah Kagan was later elevated to be a member of the court itself. So it was, and it caused, as I'm sure others will describe, huge upheaval in the peace building community. The reaction of civil society, Charity and Security Network coordinated an effort to get the State Department to use its existing power under the law to create an exception for these kind of non-tangible forms of support, a peace building exception, and they refused to do that both. So the Obama administration was not good on these issues, and what they told us all along was we're not prosecuting anyone, so don't worry about it.
How does that sit with everyone else? Lisa, Patty, Perry, you know, oh, don't worry, we won't arrest you. How did that work in practice?
No, it had the effect of everyone self-censoring themselves. So if you're working in Gaza, you stop working in Gaza because you're afraid you might have contact with Hamas and you might be charged. The same in Lebanon, you know, the same in the Horn of Africa or in Nigeria or in Afghanistan or Yemen. Like everywhere that there's a conflict and there's a group on a terrorist list, you basically can't do really effective peace building because you no longer can have any contact with those groups. So yeah, you're preventing a peace building response and peace building efforts at the ground level, which we know are more effective. And you know, here we are 20 years into this war, and you know, just trust us, this is going to work. And yes, we're winning these wars. You know, maybe the first 10 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, Congress could listen to that and think that it was true. But now we can clearly see that these military-led approaches did not work. And actually, it was more like taking a baseball bat to a hornet's nest. We have a worse problem today than we did 20 years ago. And so, you know, the exaggeration of the effectiveness of violence while undermining the peace building response around the world. It was sort of this 1-2 thing of put all your money into the violent response and make sure that no NGOs are out there trying to build peace with Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram or the Taliban. So we have a world today that is more fraught with terrorism because of this material support law.
If I could just build on that, Paul, I think Lisa captured it so well. I mean, the chilling effect was massive at that stage. I mean, you know, I had said earlier, the humanitarian community didn't pay too much attention to it in some ways outside of the real conflict zones. But when this came, a lot more attention was paid because suddenly, as I said, you had organizations, you had countries, you had the UN starting to put clauses in. Fear was really ramped up. What does this mean? What will be caught? How do we protect ourselves? And so that created a whole new level of concern in places that were not even on the radar of Congress as being a concern for terrorist organizations. But they were designated terrorists by someone. And then how do you just protect yourself against all of this? And there was an enormous misunderstanding. Humanitarians did not invest in training ourselves on what this meant and how we can protect ourselves. And part of that is because and that we'll get to that later, recommendations, it's costly to do that. So it was a lot easier to just say, just avoid it. Like, you know, the way to train yourself is don't do it. And we pulled back operations. We didn't work with certain populations. But then even more so, and I know we'll get into this in the future, material support has gotten further and further, I mean, the Holder, judgment was about peace building, a training. Now material support has become about, did you feed a terrorist when they came through your village? That's material support. Were you raped by a terrorist? That's material support. And that lack of clarity, the refusal to clarify what material support actually means, and the willingness of some within our government to allow it to be pretty much any contact with an organization or an individual, even if it's an unwilling terrorist, which we know they exist, then you have just enormous swaths of population who are in need, who are now not even eligible to receive the assistance that could help them potentially not feel angered at others. And so there's just so much that snowballs as a result of this decision beyond the intent of trying to clarify. It actually took it, the fear just ramped up, and the chilling effect is the only way to describe it. It just really stopped a lot of operations.
I don't want to belabor the conversation, but I do want to make one other point, as well as endorsing everything that's been said so far. I think to some people this could seem like a pretty esoteric issue in terms of, for those not involved in peace building or humanitarian support. But I do think there's a broader point here, that we've consistently seen that all of the techniques and tactics and mechanisms in this militarized response of the global war on terror start kind of over there and then come back here. So we saw the MRAP kind of up armored Humvees were designed to basically protect Marines and US Army personnel in Fallujah, and now they're driving around US cities. We had kind of surveillance techniques that were designed to target Al-Qaeda leadership that a few years later were used by the NSA against American citizens. And here we're seeing kind of material support provisions which are designed to go after terrorism, suddenly going after US civil society. So I think this issue does highlight the importance of this issue, not just to those narrowly focused on these issues, such as all of us, but even to the broader public as we see civil liberties erode and potentially erode further.
I just want to add on to that, because I think, if we treated domestic violent extremists in the United States with this laws, so many conservative evangelical churches would have to be charged for providing material support to the January 6th Proud Boys and the 3%ers. I mean, because, we have a vast violent extremist movement in the United States right now. And there are a lot of religious organizations and many other civil society organizations who are tacitly supporting them. So are we going to imprison all of those people?
Right. Thank you for that. I wanted to pull on one sort of thread of this with the Holder decision, and I think Patty used the phrase chilling effect. And I've been in these conversations now with government officials and colleagues and members of the Charity and Security Network, and I know there's a lot of frustration when government says, can you give us evidence or give us data points of where this happened? Because chilling effect is a little squishy, right? But I also know that the NGO community has become very professional and very diligent and disciplined when it comes to their own due diligence around their programming. And it's costly. It's costly in terms of actual money and person hours spent and so on. So if I were on the radio, someone would say, well, where's the question in there, Paul? I guess the question is your own observations about this tension between, it's now something I think that civil society does very well, but it's still costly. And there are still times, I think Yemen is a good example, when operations basically ceased because we were like, whoa, Ansar Allah has been designated, and maybe it only lasted 72 hours, but still things ground to a halt. So I maybe it's not a specific question, but maybe I'm looking for a response. How, am I accurate in that depiction? And is there, maybe we're beginning to get into the solutions, what can be done to maybe begin to shine some light on this and to find some relief? And I'll take anyone.
I'll jump in first, since I'm not on mute, that I'd say you're right, and that there's enormous cost. And a lot of what I've seen in working with CSN members and in contact with organizations outside the US as well, is that a lot of the due diligence that existed prior to 9/11 was already designed to make sure that resources reach the intended beneficiaries, and even as a charity, that you make sure that your resources are spent for your mission, and your mission is the exact opposite of terrorism. So there weren't a lot of anti-terrorism specific due diligence practices. What has emerged in large measure is groups have gotten more sophisticated at protecting those assets and making sure they reach beneficiaries. But there's also a whole host of measures that are adopted not to stop terrorism, but to stop being prosecuted under one material support or sanctions, or a violation of some of these rules, whether the rules make sense or not. And so there's a lot of waste that's forced upon organizations in terms of dealing with the plethora of rules and regulations that Patty referred to, and how they've grown exponentially.
I just highlight, Kay referred to the Somalia situation. We've talked about Yemen. I mean, there's a lot written on that. I don't think we want to get into all the history here, but they take time. So we have gotten licenses. Humanitarians have gotten licenses, but peace builders have not. So that's one, we should make that really a clear distinction. There's, we still have a huge gap in who's helping and how they're helping and what we're looking at in terms of the goal and the mission. So those who are like directly saving lives is the interpretation, are allowed an exemption, but it's very piecemeal. We have to fight for it each time. While we're fighting for it, there's people who are suffering. There's already a lot of damage done in how we're perceived by that community, how we're perceived by the government, how we're perceived by these armed groups. So that the challenge is it's just a constant fight all the time. So yeah, there's due diligence, there's things we can do, but I want to comment on the evidence comment you made, Paul, because I'll be honest, I'm pretty sure the peace builders feel the same. The humanitarian organizations, we're kind of tired of this narrative. Give us the evidence. There is evidence. Interaction actually just created a database of some of that evidence to try and put it out there. Yes, there are some who are more protective. There's a little like, I don't want to hide my dirty laundry, I want to hide my dirty laundry, but there's also those who don't want to be targeted by individuals, the private citizens who are now seeing this as a way also to go after organizations who they feel maybe, they want to accuse them of supporting terrorists, who have politicized some of this as well. So there are various reasons, various drivers why I think NGOs have not been as forthcoming with each other and on a common position as they could have, but the evidence has been brought forward on, especially on these large situations. It has been, written about, it has been, there's a lot of evidence out there, but that narrative continues. And I think it happens in every administration, we're told that same thing. And I feel it's the evidence really comes down to no one wants to be seen as pro-terrorist, and civil society is an easy target. It's an easy target to show that you're anti-terrorist and here's a space we can control. And who's going to be the one fighting for us on the Hill, in the Supreme Court, anywhere where the immediate reaction is, so you're pro-terrorist? You want to help terrorists? No one wants to go there. And that's why the give me the evidence continues to be the refrain, because it's a way to back away from having to pick up that flag of maybe this actually needs to be revised more broadly, but it's a very difficult conversation.
I'll say, I think it really gets to this issue of civil society space and the lack of so much government not understanding the origins of the Geneva Convention, even that, the Geneva Convention emerged from the development of the Red Cross, which saw that in the middle of a battlefield, you had to have people who were impartial, who could go out and help the wounded on the battlefield. That's where all of this really started, with this need to have some people who are not seen as one side or the other. So nobody's going to be shooting at them. But by government sort of imposing this, you're either with us or against us paradigm on everything, they're making civil society targets. And one clear evidence of that is the skyrocketing attacks on civil society workers and journalists around the world. That now suddenly journalists and civil society groups in Afghanistan are, forced to, if you're going to be allowed to work with the US, then you have to never talk with the Taliban. You can't have any contact with them. Same in the Horn of Africa or in Yemen. So like if you're forcing civil society to choose, you're then also putting sort of a target on them. And we see that happening around the world with increasing attacks.
Right. Well, thank you for that. Patty, you used the word license, and I want to sort of pivot here to something, I don't know if the word, day-to-day or tactical is right, but sanctions. And it's a lot to say about sanctions, so let me try to be concise and pick on two things, I suppose. One is the growth in the use of sanctions by the US government. A lot has been written about this. It's sort of a no-cost way for people in Congress to be seen as doing something. And yet, I think most on this conversation would probably agree the efficacy is highly dubious, and the implications and the challenges for civil society are legion. And so I'm curious to get a sense of your take on sanctions, but more specifically, licenses, when they are available, are often very burdensome. They take a long time. It's unclear how they make decisions. And I'm going to wrap a third thing in here. And then I think after some conversation around this, we'll begin to look to solutions. This is a bit of a segue. We have an administration today that came into office saying they're doing a full review of US sanctions on their efficacy, on the consequences, and so on. And we're waiting to hear about that. But Congress has a role to play as well, because the law that allows presidents to impose sanctions, after all, is a congressional law, the International Economic and Emergency Powers Act, IEPA. And so on the one hand, there's a couple of ways to tackle this from our perspective, from the NGO perspective. On the other hand, they've become an article of faith in US foreign and security policy. So I know I just threw a lot at you, but I'm curious, your view of sanctions and whether there is some hope or some optimism around the review or sanctions or licensing reform.
I'll jump in and start with, there was a key thing that happened in Executive Order 13224 in 2001, which used the Patriot Act authority to impose counterterrorism sanctions on Al-Qaeda and groups associated with Al-Qaeda. And what it did, it had an obscure paragraph of legalese that canceled the existing humanitarian exemption in the primary sanction statute. That exemptions allows for the delivery of food and medicine and other goods necessary to save lives. It helps distinguish civilian populations who may be in areas where the terrorist groups operate or under the control of a governing power that's a listed terrorist group, and distinguishes the group from the civilians. What Executive Order 13224 and every counterterrorism executive order since in the last 20 years has done is cancel that exemption and basically impose the sanctions more broadly. And so that makes it much more difficult to deliver aid in these areas, because then it forces groups to go to the Department of Treasury and seek a license or special permission, rather than assume that humanitarian assistance is okay in the first place and could only be limited if there's a problem. You start out assuming it's a problem, and we're only going to allow it after in some specialized circumstances. So that's something that Congress could act to restore or enforce that exemption, and the Biden administration could amend all those counterterrorism executive orders to restore that exemption.
If I could jump in on this issue of the exemptions, I mean, I'm not a lawyer myself, I should say that at the outset, but my understanding of IEPA is that the powers that it gives to the executive are quite extraordinary and quite broad. And if you actually look at the sanctions that Congress imposes, I mean, on a case like Iran, in many cases, what they're really doing is constraining the ability of the administration to be judicious in their application through kind of canceling the different national security exemptions. So, I think this gets back to this kind of almost ethos of pick a side, the almost assumption that, diplomacy's for wimps, diplomacy's for losers. We, Congress, are going to tell you how you're going to apply your own sanctions, which, whether in 13224, et cetera. Or other mechanisms. I mean, one, if there's a glimmer of hope here, my read on the kind of appeal of sanctions for Congress stems in large part, I mean, it goes back to what you said, Paul, that Congress wants to look tough, but ultimately they don't want to be held accountable for their actions. And so we've seen Congress duck issues of authorization of use of military force kind of time after time after time since 2002. There was no AUMF for Syria. There was no AUMF for Libya. And so my kind of hypothesis is if Congress got more involved in issues of AUMF, it might deflate some of the pressure on sanctions to do something. And so the fact that the House of Representatives, at least, did vote to withdraw the 2002 AUMF for Iraq, I think is an interesting space to watch. If in fact Congress has decided that they need to become more active in their ultimate congressional authority, which is on issues of war and peace, I think it actually does create space for more nuanced discussions on sanctions going forward. But we'll see where that goes.
I'll just put a word in here on the exemptions on Afghanistan. So right now the US government is looking at only exempting humanitarian activities for any US organization in Afghanistan. So what that means is peace building groups operating in Afghanistan, it will be illegal for them to operate under the Taliban regime. So it's even if they have funding from another country, as long as they're US based, basically these provisions will make it impossible for them to do any work. And again, this kind of gets to the basic theory of change. Does peace building work? Is it helpful to have people on the ground trying to, have conversations with the Taliban, talk about girls' education, women's empowerment, all the important things there on the ground? Or are we only going to be threatening them and, this sort of punishment mentality when reality, shows us that punishment has not worked? We spent over $6 trillion on the global war on terror with, a worse off world today. And so this lack of evidence for the military approach and the sanctions approach of punishment and this, making it illegal to have peace building conversations at the same time, it's really untenable.
Just to build on that as well, because I think that's an excellent point. It's also the connection to US government funds, right? So humanitarian agencies that are not working with US government funds or humanitarian agencies that are local, they don't get an exemption. They're not exempt, right? So how can we say that we believe, we want the localization, we want community leadership, we want the change to be from within, but criminalize them all at the same time, or at least to have the threat of criminalization. So, we're just, and that lack of understanding, that lack of clarity on what is actually intended, where they want to go, purposeful or not, so you can argue whether it is purposeful, that's then interpreted even more strictly and written down by other governments, by the United Nations in their policies and their regulations. So even if the US says, well, other organizations, other governments can do whatever they want, we're looking at those who we fund, we want to make sure our money doesn't go to that. It's ignoring the role the US plays in everyone else watching what they do and doing stronger, because they don't want to run afoul of the US. So the United Nations puts in much stronger language, much clearer language, maybe even further than the US government intended it to go. The European Union might go a little bit further because they also want to protect that relationship. And suddenly you have what was a unclear policy, but only for this one small subset of actors, suddenly ripples and the entire community is impacted. And that becomes really challenging to work through. So even if, as the humanitarian saying, okay, we've got an exemption, it's not enough because it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't look at humanitarianism being exempted or peace building being exempted. It looks literally at humanitarian organizations working with US government money are exempted within these conditions, but with these exceptions still in play. And that becomes a very hard hurdle for organizations to work through. But it allows others to say, we did it, we gave a license, we did our job. And so we need to stop letting people off the hook for giving us that little bit and actually push for more.
Yeah. No, thank you all for that. I wanted to touch on one other aspect here and then go into the section where I ask you all, what needs to change and what are the prospects for change. But before I do that, we've limited the conversation so far pretty much to government entities and their regulations and NGO and civil society. But there's another, there's another elephant in the room, which is the private sector, and more specifically the financial sector, banks and financial, transaction companies and so on. And those on the call familiar with the word de-risking. Banks are very risk averse, and their focus is on profit. And the minute there is and I'm editorializing here, of course, but the minute there is any scintilla of risk when it comes to sending funds to a zip code that is, troublesome, they'd rather not do it, and they just don't do it. And when you add to that a civil society customer with very few zeros after the dollar sign, it's even more pronounced. And so curious if you have things to say with respect to the financial access issue, experiences or prospects for change. And I'll understand if there's quiet.
I know that there's been some multilaterals who have tried to work on this issue and are looking at it. The World Bank, for example, has led some of these conversations. I mean, one of the challenges I do feel we have is I feel the civil society, we've let the Department of Justice, Department of Treasury off the hook for the fact that they can influence the banks.
Mhm.
So we kind of, we are pushing on the banks to do better, but they also, they're working with these same kind of unclear policies and procedures. They're working with contracted out organizations that have checklists of what they're looking for. And you hit one of those checks and you go off into, like you say, you're no longer a viable client for us. But when we go to talk to them about it, often they'll say, well, we're just following the guidance we're given. So there's a little bit of a hot potato that goes on. The banks are definitely, we need to look at what influences them and see if we can help drive that. I remember I was in a big meeting with, banks and the World Bank and department, US government officials, and the US government officials were pretty much saying, well, it's not on us. The banks are doing what they're doing. We're partners with you on this. And I'm like, well, actually, no, they're following your lead, but you're not giving them clarity. There's not, we don't have much to go back at them at. So that's a challenge I think that we have to face with ourselves is, have we been targeted enough in some of that dialogue, or are we so? And one of the things we had thought about talking about on this discussion was, were different administrations better than others? I would say the biggest challenge with different administrations was how civil society acted towards different administrations. So we expected certain administrations to help us out, to have our back, and they didn't. And that we lost years. We lost years in this battle because we said, here's the evidence. We trust you. Go do something. And they said, we got your back. We know what it's like. We're sorry for you. But they actually didn't do more for us than the other administrations. And so banks went further and further along their path. And now we have a much harder, we have a lot more carve back to do, because this is kind of systems and structures have been set in place. And So I just think on that side, it's easy to kind of paint the corporations as entirely the bad guy in this dynamic. But I think where you started, Paul, is important. They're in it for the profit. We need to meet them with that, and we need to make sure that they have what they require to ensure that that we're not soft targets. Kay, you've done some work on this. Why are we assessed as soft targets? Why are NGOs within the US government regulations, why do we fall into that category? Why can't they help us with that?
I agree very much with what Patty said about not letting Treasury and Department of Justice off the hook here. We've worked on this access to financial services issues for some time. Our first meeting at Charity Security Network was in 2014, when we had multiple members had been coming to us about the problems they were starting to experience, and we pulled together an effort, and the Treasury Department didn't want to hear about it. We brought it up, and they kept saying, bring us the evidence. So we worked with the Gates Foundation and did an empirically valid, very expensive and very thorough survey of US charities that operate international, found that 2/3 of them were having problems. Everyone from universities to educational exchange programs to humanitarian and peace building. It's incredibly widespread. And now, because of the role of the US banking system in the world, it has spread globally. And after our report was published, the World Bank attempted to launch a multi-stakeholder dialogue to bring people together to address this. The nonprofits and the banks showed up. The US government did not. And so the effort fizzled. In the meantime, one thing we learned from the banks in that process was that they used what's called the Bank Examiner's Manual. The banking regulators have examiners that go in regularly and take very thorough assessment and look at the way the banks do business, and including compliance with sanctions and counterterrorism rules. And the bank examiners, we learned in our research, were asking questions: why are you having these charity accounts? And then the bank examiners go back and say, well, wait, the regulators have a bank examination manual that sets out the old George Bush administration framework around nonprofits as being risky, scary threats of terrorist financing, even though that's been completely discredited, that theory. And so the banks and the nonprofits got together and wrote a draft redo of the chapter on nonprofits for the bank examination manual and submitted it to the bank regulators. In October, it will be 4 years, and they still haven't done anything with it. We've managed to talk with them twice, and they basically say, we're working on it, we're working on it. As Patty said, we got your back, et cetera, but no action. And the banks face the same ambiguities in the law and the same potential of criminal and sanctions enforcement that civil society does. So this is an area where we really need government to take some responsibility.
Can I jump in on this point? Because I think Kay makes a really important point on the not just compliance by financial institutions, but over compliance by financial institutions. Is it really opens the door for malign actors to weaponize all of this. So I can put something, say Patty, I can kind of say something, I heard, guilt by association, Patty did this. And then Kay cites me, and then Lisa cites Kay. My maybe initial report gets discredited, but then suddenly there's all this stuff saying that Patty is associating with terrorists, and it becomes impossible to essentially impossible to disprove. And any financial institution will say, you know what, it's not worth the compliance risk. And so we really have seen now whole networks or kind of economies being created to monetize this weaponization of basically character attacks, whether on material support or guilt by association, with just a devastating impact, certainly in the peace building field.
Well,
and for the record, I should say, I have no evidence against Patty.
Patty, I think your point, first of all, thank you all. All of those are excellent points. But But your point about, during the Obama years when the community may have felt like, oh, this is going to be great, they're going to fix it. I can't maybe react strongly enough. That is so true across different issues. And I know that I think when President Obama was elected, we heard him say, when I say we, I think at the time I was working on different issues, but I think it was borrowed from maybe Roosevelt or Truman saying, okay, well, you want me to do this, you make me do it. Meaning, don't let up on the political or policy pressure. We can be colleagues and fellow travelers and on the same page, but if you guys get complacent, by you guys, the body politic, our community, and expect bureaucracy or appointees to move things forward without some continued pressure and energy, it ain't going to happen unless it's a central organizing theme of that administration. And our issues are not, I think, is to be fair, or at least the political winds are not there right now. So having said that, I would like to move into paths forward. How do we fix these things? And that's a whole other webinar, I suppose, but some of you hinted at what needs to happen. I think I did as well. There's a legislative option. There's working with administrations. I think there's certainly a public education and journalist education effort, but without demanding too much, maybe choose one or two things that you think are either most important or most feasible in the near term with respect to the things we've covered: material supports, counterterrorism sanctions. Is there something that could be done as low-hanging fruit with respect to licensing reform? I'd like to hear. I think our audience would like to hear, what needs to change and what can change in the near to medium term. And then I would like to open it up to questions. We've got a couple of questions that people have submitted through the Q&A. But after this part of the conversation, I'd like to make it more public square part. So anyone, feel free to jump in.
I'll just repeat what Patty said earlier about defining what material support is, what it looks like, so you know whether you can be charged with doing that thing. Because leaving it ambiguous means that we all censor and stop or prevent ourselves from doing many things because we don't know. So defining it, and I think, in the more medium term, Congress and civil society and government has to figure out what's the space for civil society. Are we simply government program implementers and we just do only what government directs and pays for us to do? Or is there a place in a democracy for civil society to have a more independent space where they are able to be trusted as people supporting democratic institutions and not supporting violent extremism or terrorism? How do we create this civil society space, I think, is the ultimate question.
I'll just add a couple of things. I mean, one is a global license would be a starting point. Right? Really, let's stop making it piecemeal. Let's really make it what it needs to be, include peace building in it, not just humanitarian, because you can't talk about recovery and long-term and wanting to get out of situations if you're not actually investing in recovery and long-term. So make that global license what it's needed. And somebody's got to champion that. Someone's got to be the one who says, this isn't about being pro-terrorist, it's about being pro-people, and how are we going to move this forward? In the meanwhile, there needs to be a new risk balance. At the moment, there is zero tolerance, and zero tolerance doesn't exist in life. It doesn't happen. There's always risk in everything we do. There's a risk the internet's going to crash right now and I'm going to be lost on. There's always those parameters. Nothing is guaranteed. Yet for counterterrorism rules, there is zero tolerance. One bag of rice, the whole truck has to be disavowed, right? One training, all these things, one person who has some allegation, it's so hard. And we're always told, civil society, you need to learn to be more like the corporate sector, right? There's this, tension that's put forward that somehow we're not professional enough. We don't have our matrix enough. We're not clear enough about how we're focused on that return on investment. the corporate sector would never work with zero tolerance. It doesn't exist. Walmart has a spillage. There's going to be a thing of salsa that falls into, off somebody off the car. It's going to be written off. They're not going to say everything from that entire, Walmart is disavowed. No, they're going to say, well, we lose some things. There's some theft. There's some breakage. It's okay. That's within our parameters of operating towards our goal. The military even has, obviously, unfortunately, we've seen the photos. Items get taken. We still invest in the military. We don't stop funding the military. But the NGOs, the civil society, any small thing, and it is an issue. And that risk parameter, it's just unrealistic, and it's unhealthy, and it just creates either people driving, either not helping and not doing what they need to do, or they're not being honest, which is exactly what you're trying not to. You want accountability, you want transparency. You have to have a more realistic perspective. And then the third thing I would say is, if you're going to ask for all these restrictions, you need to invest in helping organizations fund doing it. Because right now, the training, the managing the structures, all these bureaucracy, a lot of organizations who could possibly be helping, they don't do it because it would drive their overhead through the roof, and they're going to get, smacked by Charity Navigator or somebody for having a high overhead, right? So it's like you can't win, right? Because there's not enough of a narrative about how to explain that the bureaucratic hurdles you have to go through to work in these environments to help people is costly. But meanwhile, you'll read all these articles saying we can't abandon Afghanistan. We still need to work in Afghanistan. But do people really want to see, okay, you know what, to work in Afghanistan, I'm going to have like a 30-40% overhead because I need to follow these parameters. But we don't have that narrative. We don't have that story. And so that's another thing I would say is we need to invest in it, make it a direct cost if you need to, but help organizations work in these environments while we work through the risk parameters, while we work through the global license. But it's a process, it's a step, and we need to have all of it at the same time move forward. Those would be my top three.
Maybe I'll jump in on Patty's last point, and just say that it's obviously both on the donor side and the implementer side, it's obviously the bigger organizations that can manage this stuff. I mean, I work for RBF, we do the vetting, we do equivalency determinations, et cetera, et cetera. It just means ultimately we have less funding to partners and more goes to these kinds of things. And, organizations like Mercy Corps or International Rescue Committee, they'll make do, they'll figure it out. They'll be less efficient as a result, presumably. But those who really suffer are the kind of individual donors or the small grassroots organizations. So I do think there's space within the philanthropic sector to think of some kind of burden sharing mechanisms, whereas the larger organization that have some sunk costs into doing this kind of vetting can find ways to share the wealth. I mean, that's an ambitious thing. I'm not very optimistic that something like that can actually happen, but there's no reason that every individual donor needs to recreate the wheel within the entire ecosystem. And then the last thing in terms of just recommendations is, again, I'll kind of end where I started, which is I think as a society, we've come to understand the risks of militarism in terms of boots on the ground and, invasions. But I think we need to have those same conversations about what does a less militaristic approach look like in terms of material support, in terms of sanctions, in terms of investing in diplomacy, et cetera, et cetera. So embedding this conversation within a larger kind of conversation about, shifting the narrative on the U.S. role in the world, frankly, I think is important as well.
Just quickly add to that there over the last 20 years, there has been a lot of progress made in terms of the way many in government and official bodies like the UN or Financial Action Task Force see civil society no longer see us as a threat as they did in the early days after 9/11, but see us as an important part of establishing sustainable peace in the world and ending conflict and saving lives. I think the US government has further to go and really coming to that policy position where, but there are signs of progress. The Global Fragility Act, which passed a few years ago, was a game changer in terms of looking at ways to address foreign policy by focusing on drivers of conflict and drivers of instability and extremism. That kind of thing needs to be expanded and supported, but of course, you can't implement it and help people. Say in Nigeria, a child soldier who is kidnapped by Boko Haram, you can't help them get out of that if you can't talk to them. So we have kind of the tension in the US right now in terms of wanting to go in a particular direction, but hamstringing ourselves with our outdated legal framework from 20 years ago. And the last thing I'll say is that we've talked over 20 years on these issues. I've talked to a lot of people in government about this. And it's been a long time since anybody really expressed a concrete fear that civil society organizations were really diverting resources to terrorist groups. I think they know that hardly ever happens. They know that our work mostly benefits situations in conflict and helps reduce it and helps save lives. They know that. What they're afraid of, they're more afraid of than terrorists, is political blowback in the US. And that's where the onus is on us as civil society to raise our voices, to give them cover, to do the sensible and right thing.
Great. Thank you, Kay, for that. And I want to say, I think I would be remiss in my own duties if I didn't remind folks that the Charity and Security Network, our role in this is sort of predominantly as a hub, as an information resource and a connector, as Perry was saying, for large and financially robust organizations that do this work, all the way down to very small scale practitioners, a legal and informational resource, but also a hub and a participant in, and in some cases, a leader in advocacy. Advocacy predominantly with a small a, but with respect to legislative changes that need to be made, material support and so on. Engagement and advocacy with the administration, with the relevant executive branches when it comes to things like Treasury and OFAC licenses and sanctions and so on. And so that is why we were having and hosting this conversation. We're sort of a small team, but we like to try to punch above our weight class. That being said, we're far stronger because of the network and the membership we have. Thank you for that. I think those are very interesting and relevant and all urgent priorities. The culture change, if you will, the view of how government looks at civil society, the view of how we as a nation look at the value of peace building, for example, humanitarian assistance, development, and so on, that's a longer arc, but one that we are, I think, steadfast in doing. I see there's one question in the Q&A. Actually, there's two questions in the Q&A I'm going to ask and see if folks on the panel have responses. I'm not certain, and I hope this is the case, that those of you in the audience, if you have responses to some of these questions, or if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand or put it in the Q&A, because I want to try to facilitate this to the best of my ability as a group conversation. Someone asked about the current state of play with respect to humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan, and what changes, if any, do any of you see over the next few months? And as an adjunct to that, what advocacy can be done to make sure that NGOs can do effective work?
Patty, why don't you take that?
Thanks. I mean, that's a challenging question because we don't know what will come. I mean, in many ways, the Taliban didn't have the same designation as other groups. I mean, in terms of like Boko Haram, so that there were already some flexibilities, though a lot of concerns just because of the militarization and the US presence that was there. For example, when I went to Afghanistan in 2019, NGOs telling us that when they would go meet with the Taliban, which they were allowed to do, and the government the forces knew that they were meeting with the Taliban, they would never tell them where they were meeting them, right? So, and even many of the organization staff wouldn't know where the liaison was meeting them because they were concerned about drone strikes. Now things are going to change. I don't know what will happen with the way things have unfolded. I don't think anyone knows what will happen. Will there be a pressure put to change the designation of the Taliban? Will it be more extreme, such as Hezbollah, or, in terms of a designation that's much more restrictive, or will it still be somewhat flexible as it has been, and allow organizations to work within that? So one is, we just don't know what's going to occur. I think the main thing that organizations are going to be very concerned about in Afghanistan is how flexible and nimble their funding is, and how they can adapt and change to the situation on the ground. The counterterrorism regulations bring risks, and the balancing and mitigating of those risks bring other risks. So, if you're looking at, for example, security risk may come as a result of changing one thing, or your program implementation will change dramatically because of it. So I hate to say it, but if someone who's listening in knows the answers, I'd love to hear it. But I'll be honest, I don't think anyone knows quite yet how it's going to unfold. But those who are there have been there for a long time. They're trying desperately to continue to work with national actors on the ground, and I think they will continue to do that. I think the biggest change we will see is we'll see some of the smaller organizations and some of the more multi-mandated development humanitarian organizations. They may start to withdraw, and you're left with the more purist organizations that feel they have the ability to manage that within their programming. And which is unfortunate, because it will mean less services available to Afghans. But I don't know, Lisa, you're the one with multiple years of experience in Afghanistan. You may have some additional insight there.
I think you're exactly right, Patty.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both. I think it's perfectly valid and accurate to say we just don't know. I can't help but also connect back to what Perry has been really reminding us throughout this whole conversation. None of this occurs in a political vacuum, and for better or worse, I got to believe that the president's political advisors and policy advisors are saying, "Wow, this is the one giant factor in Afghanistan right now is uncertainty." And so when you have uncertainty, it's not a recipe for being proactive. It's a recipe for a wait and see approach. And that's exactly the opposite of what civil society needs to be enabled right now.
I would add the second part of that question about what can be done. What can we do to help support civil society actors in Afghanistan? As it was mentioned earlier, that right now the US government hasn't taken any concrete steps through the licensing process to help organizations continue to operate with legal safety and legal safeguards in Afghanistan. There was apparently a license, a very strange situation where Treasury gave a license to USAID to operate. And so USAID funded organizations could theoretically work in Afghanistan, but they have to apply for a specific license, which is a lengthy process. So, and those are treated on a case-by-case basis. And when you have case-by-case review, it basically means you have no policy. In fact, we've asked for OFAC in the past in Syria, for example, to issue some policy statement on common factual situations that many NGOs face, and they said no, it all has to be on a case-by-case basis. So what really needs to be done, one thing we can push in Afghanistan is for the kind of general license that would allow not just humanitarian work, but all civil society programs, including peace building and human rights defenders, organizations working to protect women and girls, to continue their work or to come in and even expand their work. And there have been some push to get the government to do that, but that's something that needs to be ongoing and growing. And
Patty and Perry, this is my own question. I'm curious if Patty, I know it's hard because you're so on the front lines with the work on the ground, but from a philanthropic point of view, I'm just curious, and maybe you can share with our audience, what are the conversations like among peers in the funding community? I mean, I have to imagine there's also disruption and uncertainty, but have you seen, or are you encouraged by some creativity or some ways of doing things that in some way are different. And I know it's extremely also risky for philanthropies to put their dollars out there on a limb, so to speak. But I'm curious if in different funder communities or affinity groups, there are some conversations saying, wow, let's try something different or new, or curious to hear.
Ari, I'll let you start with that one.
Yeah, so the RBF does have a small Afghanistan portfolio, and it to this point, I think our main focus is really just listening to our partners. And I mean, first and foremost, folks are obviously prioritizing their own care and safety, and in many cases, evacuation. And so, on the positive side, there has been a tremendous influx of interest, particularly in the short-term kind of humanitarian response. I think some partners are some in the philanthropic sector are kind of thinking, what can we do in the medium term to kind of take advantage of this moment of support for Afghan civil society, for Afghan women, for kind of quote unquote liberal values, and is there something are there structures that can be that Afghan civil society can put in place that can kind of provide a vector for that support going forward. But it won't surprise you, Paul, to hear that there are many questions and not very many answers at this point.
Thanks for that.
I don't have much to add other than complex humanitarian emergencies are not philanthropy's favorite place to put their money. So I think that that's going to be a challenge. The more Afghanistan now gets defined under that regression into more of a complex humanitarian emergency than the development portfolio that was kind of the narrative for many years in terms of where it was going. Those of us who had visited and been there might have said it was still very much a mix of the two. But I think that I am fearful of some pullback as people try and figure out, well, what is this? And if this is a complex emergency, where's my impact? What am I doing? Because that may be a challenge for them. And that'll be upon, the UN and other actors to really kind of make sure that narrative is there, that there is a space that's really clear and for them to move forward. So agreeing with Perry that it's really important. They shouldn't retrench. They need to keep investing.
Right. Great. Well, we're at about 10:25 right now, and there's nothing in the queue. So I wanted to sort of say last call for questions and answers. And despite my caveat at the beginning of the conversation, as I go over sort of the questions that we had discussed, we pretty much covered things, I think. I obviously, we don't have all the answers. As always, these types of conversations raise more questions than they answer. But I want to make an appeal to not only the panelists, but the audience our goal here today is to make this the beginning of continuing to engage and discuss and frankly strategize on the path forward and the solutions. This wasn't supposed to be just a history lesson. This is a future sort of call for action, if you will. But I want to give folks among the panel a last chance to any parting shots or questions or reflections. Lisa, you had a hand in the air.
Right. I just wanted to say thank you to the Charity and Security Network for hosting this event. But Kay, really looking to you for organizing these over the last 15 years. You and I have sat on panels on this topic literally for 15 years, and we are saying almost the exact same thing. And I'm just so grateful that you keep putting it in front of the policy community, because these laws really are shifting everything about our field of peace building and civil society work, whether it's humanitarian or development. So thank you, Paul, and the team that you work with for hosting this and for looking forward. But just keep this in front of us.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. Perry or Patty, anything?
I don't have anything to add. I think Lisa summed it up nicely, and thanks for the opportunity.
Here, here.
And I'll just say, thank you, Lisa, but thank you for the panelists, the people who are listening to this and will listen to it once it's posted. And for all the organizations that have put effort into an issue that's not part of their regular day job or was never supposed to be, but has been kind of imposed on us for the last 20 years, and a remarkable civil society response that's now internationally, we coordinate with allies all over the world, and it's growing. And I go back to what Paul said, President Obama challenged us, make me do my job. So I look forward to continue to work with people on just that.
Terrific. Well, thank you to all our panelists, to Lisa, to Perry, to Patty, and of course, my colleague Kay. And thank you to everyone who has participated and those who asked questions. And don't hesitate to reach out to the Charity and Security Network. We'd be happy to put you in touch with folks on the panel today. I think, they're not particularly mysterious or hidden. I'm sure there are ways to reach them if you would like to continue the conversation. And I realize it's Monday, so we're just kicking off the week, but I hope everyone stays healthy, safe, and productive, and wish you well. Thanks very much to everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.